Hi, and welcome to week 2, lesson 7 for ELA grade 12. My name is Seema, and I will be walking you through this distance learning lesson. So quickly, what we can expect from this video today, I'll go over the materials that you'll need for the lesson, give you a brief overview of the learning, do a quick model for you of some annotations, and then preview some of the learning for the next lesson. So let's start by getting those brain cells moving. So we'll do a little riddle. So go ahead and read this on your screen while I read it out loud for you. Which is correct to say? The yolk of the egg are white, or the yolk of the egg is white? Read that again to yourself. Think about it if you need to. Pause the video if you need to, because I'm going to go ahead and flash the answer on the screen here. The answer is neither. The yolk of an egg is yellow. So making sure you're critically thinking while you're reading is super important, both with riddles and with English text, as we'll see today. So lesson 7 is what we're on. This is in page 25 of your learning packet. And you'll also need today your note catcher, which is on page 26 of your packet. Something to write with is going to be necessary as well, a pencil or pen or whatever you have. The text that we'll be revisiting today is A Changing World. It's the same text as lessons 5 and 6, where we did the first read of the text. And today we are going to be going back into the reading to revisit some paragraphs and do a close reading of some of the text. The target for today is I can explain the effect of historical events. So the main historical period that we're focusing on, of course, with this text is the British colonial era. And the reason we're doing this is to increase our knowledge about the time period so that then we can better understand future texts that are upcoming in this unit. So again, really thinking about how British colonialism complicated the idea of home for different populations and how the key events from this time period relates to the idea of finding a home. So those are the two questions we're again going to keep in mind today as we're rereading some of these parts of the text. So to reread today, you'll be rereading these 3 sections that you see on the screen here. Voices of the Period, which is that really short section on page 17. It's that first column of the text. The War to End All Wars, and the Second World War. So those 3 sections. Pay particular attention to the quotes in the Voices of the Period section, and also to the effect of the 2 world wars. Once you've reread those sections, you'll be thinking about 3 questions. First, there are 4 quotes in the Voices of the Period section, and 3 of them focus on war. So why do you think such a high percentage of them have this focus? So think about that. And then I'd like you to go back and reread the second and third quotes from that first section. As you read the quote by David Lloyd George, underline the words or phrases that convey optimism. Then think about how George's optimism compares with the quote from George Santayana. Finally, think about the quote from Winston Churchill. How do his words relate to the concept of home? If you're able to pause the video here and complete the read and think parts of the lesson, go ahead and do that. I'm going to show you how I might think through the second question about David Lloyd George's quote. So remember, I asked you to underline the quotes or phrases that convey optimism. The last sentence where he's talking about hope is what I marked. So he says, I hope we may say that thus, this fateful morning, came to an end all wars. So here he is making a speech at the end of a long war, World War I. And he says that it is the cruelest and most terrible war that mankind has ever seen. Then he shifts to optimism, and he says that he hopes that, since the war was so cruel and so terrible, that it is the end of all wars, that he hopes it is the last war that mankind will ever see. After that, I read the quote below it, George Santayana's quote, and I see the exact opposite sentiment. Instead of being hopeful, he's actually saying that only the dead has seen the end of war, meaning that war is something that man will see over and over again until they die. So I didn't ask you to do more extensive annotating, but I did go ahead and make a note in the margin to help me remember why I underlined these sections. So I drew some arrows to remind myself that these two underlines or these two markings are connected. And then I quickly jotted down these words in the margins to note that the quotes offer opposite feelings about the recurrence of war. One is hopeful and the other is bleak. So once you're done thinking about the text using those three guiding questions, it's time to reflect a little more and to talk to a friend or family member or caregiver about the following questions. First, David Lloyd George's words were spoken on November 11th, 1918. What did he hope for, and was his hope realized? So you just spent time marking up that quote in the think section of this lesson. So look back at your annotations, look at what you underlined, and think about what else you learned about in this text about the history of Britain during that time. Use that information to have this discussion with someone. Then talk about how you might define your home if you were part of an empire that stretched around the globe. How would you define your home when that empire began breaking apart? There's no right or wrong answer here, but it might spur some interesting conversation about what home meant to people living in Britain at two different points in time. When they were building a large empire and when they had a large empire that stretched around the globe, and then afterwards when the empire started to break apart. Your writing task for today is to answer three questions. First, how did World War I extend the age of transition? Then, how did World War II test Britain's resolve? And finally, what impact did the two world wars have on Britain? You should be able to use the annotations from the text and your thoughts from the rest of this lesson to craft responses to these questions on your note catcher. In our next lesson, we'll go back and do a close reading of the two main text features that are included in the text. As always, if you need support for this lesson, feel free to email your teacher. Their email address is going to be their first name dot last name at detroitk12.org. Finally, thank you again for learning with me today. As a reminder, don't forget to talk about your lesson with someone, and especially the written part and the three questions that you answered. Try and read your writing to someone and talk about your answers with them. After that, read for 20 minutes and complete an entry in your reading log that can be found in the front of your packet. And then finally, practice your reading fluency using the first few pages of your weekly reading.